Good morning, everybody. The Beatles were a band for about 10 years. They started more or less around 1960, and on this date, May 8, in 1970, they issued their last album, Let It Be. In the early days, the Beatles did a lot of playing in Hamburg, Germany, and this photograph is from that time period, the late 1950s. You'll notice there's no Ringo Starr. He won't join the group till 1962 or so. And while they were in Hamburg, they were backup for Tony Sheridan from time to time, who was already popular. And together they came up with a record called My Bonnie. Note it says Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. Now, up in Liverpool were stores called the North End Music Stores. There were 3 of them, I think, a little chain. And they sold this record, and it sold like crazy. So the record manager, Brian Epstein, wanted to see who these Beatles were. This song was selling so much. So he met them, introduced himself, and offered to be their manager, even though he hadn't managed a band before. But they said, okay. And one of the first goals for Brian Epstein was to find a record company that would produce their stuff. And George Martin, second from the right, worked for EMI, one of the subsidiaries of EMI, a big record company, and he agreed to produce the Beatles. Kind of went out on a limb a little bit. So in 1963, their first album came out, produced by George Martin, called Please Please Me. We didn't get this record. Our first Beatle album, called Meet the Beatles, came the next year. And on that first album was a song by Carole King on the left with her husband Jerry Goffin called Chains. So in the early days, the Beatles sang some American stuff, but eventually they'll do all their own. So here they are landing at JFK. You see all the kids on the observation deck, 1964. They were really surprised at their reception. And when they sang on the Ed Sullivan Show a couple days later, it just cemented their popularity, and this was a real breakthrough for English rock and roll bands in the United States. In 1964, they did a rock and roll movie called A Hard Day's Night, and a record that went with it. Kind of zany and just really out there for that time period. In 1965, they did a big tour of the United States. Here's a picture of them at Shea Stadium, where they couldn't hear themselves play because of all the screaming. And while on that tour, they met Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan's influence on their music starts to show, particularly with sort of a dragging beat and more folky a little bit. And then George Harrison at the same time is playing the sitar. He's learning from Ravi Shankar on the right, the great sitar player from India. So when the album Rubber Soul came out in 1965, this was a real departure for the Beatles. It had a lot more influence of Bob Dylan. George plays the sitar. It wasn't just light bubblegum pop anymore, and not all Beatle fans were happy with that record. 1966, they did their last concert to a paying audience at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. Paul said once, if we can't hear ourselves, we can't improve, and everybody's screaming, so they do more studio work. So 1967 was going to be the summer of love. In the spring of 1967, the alternative community in San Francisco pronounced that that would be the summer of love, and all these kids go out to San Fran that summer, and it was in May of 67 that Sgt. Pepper came out. So one of the metaphors of that summer of love of 1967 is that we're all part of Sgt. Pepper's band. So that was an interesting way to look at it. Well, by the time we get to 1969, and this record filmed in front of the Abbey Road Studios in London, the most famous crosswalk in the world probably, there are a lot of internal tensions in the band, and they do break up. And soon after, they issue this record. So this is our event, May 8, 1970, Let It Be, even though the group had officially broken up in 1969 at the end. So the Beatles took on the name in 1960, did their last album as a group in 1970. So 10 years of really great music and a great legacy.